The following message is a presentation of Legonier Ministries, home of the radio program Renewing Your Mind with R.C. Sproul.
We come now to the end of our brief overview of the themes of the book of Deuteronomy. And chapter 31 of Deuteronomy begins with these words. Then Moses went and spoke these words to all Israel. And he said to them, I am 120 years old today. I can no longer go out and come in. And also the Lord has said to me, you shall not cross over this Jordan. Here we see the scene that is being staged for the transition from the leadership of Moses to the leadership of Joshua, for the renewal of the covenant at Moab, and the preparation for the death and the burial of Moses. Now obviously we don't have time in this brief overview of Deuteronomy to give a complete biographical sketch of Moses. But it's so easy for us in this day and age to underestimate the gigantic, monumental achievement that was found in the person and work of Moses. He is compared with Christ in the Scriptures in this way, that Moses is called the mediator of the Old Covenant as Jesus is the mediator of the New Covenant. Of course, though we make this comparison, we must not forget the contrast as well, as the book of Hebrews describes the vast superiority of Jesus over Moses. There's no question about that. Moses was a servant in the house of God, whereas Jesus is the son over the house of God. And we find those kinds of contrasts written for us in the book of Hebrews. But nevertheless, in terms of those who are purely human with no divine nature united with their humanity, none exceeds Moses in greatness in terms of being used of God in the spectacular way that he was. Certainly as the one who led the Exodus, that monumental event in Old Testament history, but also the one who bore the burden of spiritual leadership of a nation like no one before him or after him was ever called to do. One of the things I notice about Moses is that he's one of a handful of biblical persons who beg God for death. Moses had to deal with the trials of leadership, and we read the story of the Exodus and the wilderness wandering experience of Israel, and it seems like a history of 40 years of constant complaining. I mean, the catchphrase that we read over and over again in the Pentateuch is that the people murmured against God and against Moses. They were unhappy with God, but they ventilated their distress against Moses. And Moses got to the place where his leadership was in such a crisis that he came to God and said, God, if you love me, take my life. I cannot bear these people anymore. But instead of taking his life, God distributed the Spirit that he had given to Moses among the 70 elders and established an organizational structure that was designed with one end in view, and that was to relieve Moses of this enormous burden that he was carrying by himself. So never one man in all of human history, I believe, apart from Jesus, had the burden of pastoral care like Moses. And nevertheless, in spite of his greatness and in spite of his heroic measure of devotion to the things of God, he was not allowed to enter into the promised land. In chapter 31, we read in verse 14 these words, Then the Lord said to Moses, Behold, the days approach when you must die. Call Joshua and present yourselves in the tabernacle of meeting, that I may inaugurate him. And so Moses and Joshua went and presented themselves in the tabernacle of meeting. And now the Lord appeared at the tabernacle in a pillar of cloud, and a pillar of cloud stood above the door of the tabernacle. Now do you see what's happening here? Here is dynamic succession. Here, God is taking the baton of leadership that He had handed to Moses and is now passing it on to Joshua. Moses led the people out of Egypt, led them to the Promised Land, but now the task of entering the Promised Land and conquering Canaan is given not to Moses, but to Joshua. And so he said, I want the two of you, prepare for this inauguration, to come to the tabernacle, and there I will meet with you. And when Moses and Joshua come to the tabernacle, God comes too. And the people know that God has come to this place of meeting, to the tent of meeting, because the great theophany that had followed Israel through their wandering experience, the pillar of cloud, came now and rested over the sanctuary. I mean, sometimes the economy of biblical description gets in our way insofar as that we read over these things that are given in such terse descriptive terms, and we fail to feel existentially the passion of that moment where now their leader, who has taken them out of bondage and has been their comfort, the voice of God to them through all of these decades after decades, now they know that the time is coming to an end, and God comes and dwells in the midst of His people, and He's in there having a conversation with Joshua and Moses. Can you imagine what the people were feeling? Do you remember their feelings when God called Moses to the summit of Sinai? And before Moses went up to speak with the Lord on the holy mountain, that the people had to sanctify a fast, and they had to purify themselves, and they came around the base of Sinai, and there were all of these tremendous outward manifestations of the glory of God. The great cloud that enshrouded Mount Sinai, and the thundering, the lightning that was going on. And the people were not allowed to set foot on the mountain, because if they touched the mountain, they would die. And then they watched Moses more or less evaporate into this mist as he went up Mount Sinai to speak to God, and how the people huddled at the foot of Sinai for days and days, fearful for Moses' life, wondering what was going on up there, until he descended once more from the mountain, and his face was shining with such brilliance of the reflected radiance of the glory of God. So they have had experience in the past of private meetings that God had with their leader. And here comes another one. Well, let's eavesdrop for a moment on the meeting. In verse 16 in chapter 31, we read this. And the Lord said to Moses, Behold, you will rest with your fathers, and this people will rise and play the harlot with the gods of the foreigners of the land, where they go to be among them, and they will forsake me and break my covenant which I have made with them. And then my anger shall be aroused against them in that day, and I will forsake them, and I will hide my face from them, and they shall be devoured. Now let me just stop there for a second. I've been in the ministry for over 30 years, and there's a great joy of being involved in the ministry of Christ. My ministry, for the most part, has not been in the local church. It's been a teaching ministry, and so I haven't had the opportunity to be a pastor of a local congregation. But of course, I know many, many men who have. And one of the great sadnesses that men have expressed is when they will see that they have labored for 20 or 30 years in a congregation, and then they retire and they see the church fall apart. I mean, that is just an awful thing to happen when you pour yourself into the life of a group of people, trying to build them up and to lead them into maturity, and then to see them fall away. That's one of the saddest things that can happen in spiritual ministry. Well, here is Moses, the supreme pastor of the Old Testament, who has spent his life in sacrificial service to this massive multitude of people. And now he's about to die, and God said, the good news, Moses, is you are about to enter into your rest. You are to receive that rest for which you have labored so long. But let me tell you what's going to happen to your congregation after all of your labor and after all of your work. This people will rise and play the harlot with the gods of the foreigners of the land. This people will forsake me. They will break my covenant. And then my anger will be aroused against them, and I will forsake them, and I will hide my face from them. I'm going to hide my face, Moses, from your congregation. And they shall be devoured. And many evils and troubles shall befall them, so that they will say in that day, have not these evils come upon us because our God is not among us? And I will surely hide my face in that day because of all the evil which they have done, in that they have turned to other gods. Now, therefore, write down this song for yourselves and teach it to the children of Israel. Put it in their mouths, that this song may be a witness for me against the children of Israel. And then in verse 22 we read, therefore Moses wrote this song the same day and taught it to the children of Israel. And then he inaugurated Joshua the son of Nun and said, be strong and of good courage, for you shall bring the children of Israel into the land of which I swore to them, and I will be with you. Now, this is an important moment in Jewish history. It's the moment of transition when the people are about finally to enter into that land of promise that God had promised centuries earlier to Abraham. And to mark that occasion, the last task, as it were, that God assigns to Moses at the very end of his life is to compose a song. Now, why is that? If we look throughout the pages of Scripture, we find it's a rare thing, but nevertheless, periodically, we will find people composing songs on certain occasions. We see, for example, in the Old Testament, the Song of Deborah. And that song celebrates the triumph of the judges over the enemies of the day. And then we see the magnificent song of Miriam, which celebrates the triumph of God in the Exodus. The horse and the rider has he thrown into the sea, the song sings in rousing chorus. You come into the New Testament, and at the early chapters of the Gospels, we see the song of Simeon, the song of Zacharias, and of course the Magnificat, the song of Mary. And what happens is that when God writes a new chapter in redemptive history, when He gives a new victory to His people, those victories are then celebrated by the composition of a great hymn. I mean, we do that somewhat in our own culture. You think of the 1812 Overture, Wellington's victory, that sort of thing, where people of nations will write songs to commemorate for future generations a very important chapter in the national history. When we go to the book of Revelation in the New Testament, we are told that when our redemption is fully accomplished and consummated in heaven, that the Lord will give His people what? A new song. There's still that song that hasn't been composed yet, that we will all learn, that we will be able to sing in the choir in heaven. But this song of Moses, I commend to you to read in its entirety and to read carefully. Because notice, it has a twofold significance. On the one hand, it does celebrate and rehearses the work of God's redemption for the people of Israel. But it is also a song that is a testimony against the people of Israel. The purpose of the song is for them to teach it to their children so that they sing it at home, sing it as they gather together in solemn assemblies and so on, to be reminded of the God of the covenant as a witness to them of what God has done in that nation. Let's turn over then for a moment to what happens after the song has been written. At the end of chapter 32, beginning in verse 48, we read these words. Then the Lord spoke to Moses that very day, saying, Go up this mountain of Abarim, Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab, across from Jericho, and view the land of Canaan, which I give to the children of Israel as a possession, and die on the mountain which you ascend, and be gathered to your people, just as Aaron your brother died on Mount Hor and was gathered to his people. And because you trespassed against me among the children of Israel at the waters of Meribah Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin, because you did not hallow me in the midst of the children of Israel, you shall see the land before you, though you shall not go there into the land which I am giving to the children of Israel. And if we move over quickly to chapter 34, the last chapter of Deuteronomy, the narrative continues there in verse 1. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is across from Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land of Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah, and so on. And then the Lord said to him, This is the land I swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants, and I have caused you to see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his grave to this day. It's an incredible story. But God says, Moses, come up to the mountain. And you're coming up to the mountain for two things. The first thing is that you may see with your eyes the land of promise. Because you did not hallow me, you did not attribute to me the holiness and the full measure for which I should be glorified, I am not going to permit you to enter into the promised land. But Moses, my beloved, I'll let you see it. And so he asks Moses to come up on the mountain, where there he has a spectacular view of the promised land. And the second reason that God called him there was what? That you may die. You know, it's just as easy that Moses could have written the Song of Simeon. Moses could have sung the same words that Simeon sung after he beheld the newborn baby Jesus, when he said, Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, for mine eyes have beheld the salvation of Israel. Because that's what Moses beheld in terms of the primary installment of the promise that God had made to Abraham. He stood there, he looked at the promised land, and then he closed his eyes forever. And one of the tenderest footnotes that we read in all of Scripture is that God himself buried Moses. And to that day in which this was written, no one knew where his grave was. It was a secret between God and Moses. I often ask this question to my students. Did Moses ever enter the promised land? Well, he entered in the heavenly promised land, certainly. But did he ever enter the earthly promised land? And they just did what people here are doing, shaking their heads. No, yes, he did. It took a very long time, but you remember when Jesus was on the Mount of Transfiguration? Who showed up? Moses and Elijah. Every time I read the Transfiguration, I say, isn't that just like God? that he would finally, after all that time, allow Moses to stand there. Because though he wouldn't allow him to enter the promised land at that time, when the Messiah came, and the Messiah was standing in the promised land, Moses was allowed to stand there by his side. It's a magnificent story, and it's a magnificent chapter that closes the life of the mediator of the Old Testament. In this brief overview of Deuteronomy, I asked you at one point to make it a matter of personal discipline to read the book of Deuteronomy in its entirety, and I trust that many of you have done that already. But now I ask that as we complete this brief survey of Deuteronomy, that you look again and give special attention to the Song of Moses that Moses composed under God's direction and instruction. It begins in chapter 32 of Deuteronomy. It begins with these words, "Give ear, O heavens, and I will speak. And hear, O earth, the words of my mouth. Let my teaching drop as the rain, and my speech distill as the dew, as raindrops on the tender herb, and as showers on the grass." This is the word of the Lord saying, let my word fall upon the land. My speech descend, just as the rain and the dew come and wet and moisten the tender shoots that are seeking to struggle to live in the barren wilderness of the day. Ascribe greatness to our God. He is the rock. His work is perfect. For all His ways are justice, a God of truth and without injustice. Again, the focal point in this hymn is on the character of God. Read it in its entirety, absorb it, that it may become the song of your heart.
For more information about Legonier Ministries, call 1-800-435-4343 or contact us on the web at ligonier.org. That's ligonier.org. Or write P.O. Box 54, 7500, Orlando, Florida, 32854.